Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend, colleague, and co-host, Darren King, ExoAcademian. Darren, I want to start the episode with where I often leave the episode, and that's just wanting to ask our listeners to take a moment and hit the like button on the show, particularly if you're watching on YouTube. It's funny, I will look at the YouTube count, and only maybe less than 10% of the folks that watch it hit that like. So I'd like to think we get more likes than that. So if you would take a moment and do that, that would be great. And then also want to remind our listeners that we're starting a new promotional, like a sponsorship. And I know you're excited about this. I am too. And so I wanted to kind of let folks know about this. It's a new product that actually we both really like and have used. So it's Alien Mummy Gummies. Alien Mummy Gummies are the only neuroenhancing gummies on the market scientifically designed to put you in that perfect liminal state between this reality and the next. Each artisanal gummy is handcrafted with a proprietary blend of THC, CBD, DMT, and psilocybin to get you one step closer to infinite zen. Alien Mummy Gummies are free trade, certified organic, taste amazing, and have 0 calories. And if you order Alien Mummy Gummies today using promo code CuscoMG, you'll get an extra batch of Alien Mummy Gummies at no additional cost. Really excited about that, Darren. I know you're a big fan of these gummies. What do you think?
I think it's important for me to chime in here and say that Nathan just made some sort of agreement with some sort of foreign company that I had no idea about this product placement. And I'm going to have to really step aside here and say that Nathan and I are not aligned in a corporate partnership. I'm sure he meant well. Sometimes we can't cover everything we're going to talk about in the show. So
you can't blame a guy
after the fact.
I just
all joking aside, that was very well done.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah,
you even had the rhyming and stuff like that.
Well, thank you all friends for listening there and playing along with us on that opening sort of hilarious promo. But it does fit in perfectly with some of the territory we are going to cover on the show today. Before we get into some of that, though, Darren, there's still a lot going on to be optimistic about. It was a crazy week this week, but overall, we're on a really positive, interesting trajectory. Here I'm thinking specifically of the Schumer legislation that is getting one step closer to finalization. Obviously, there's a little bit of a budget fight happening in the Congress right now, but these bills typically do get passed and signed into law, so there's a great chance that that's going to come to fruition. And the language in that part of the bill is really, really powerful. Many pages, specifically mentions non-human intelligence, which I know we'll want to touch on that a little bit later as well. But just a lot of forward momentum here to be positive about. What are your thoughts on that?
Indeed, there are. And I think that's probably the ace up our sleeve more than anything is the Schumer legislation. I think that many people have acknowledged or recognized that in some ways there is a bit of a slowdown. You could argue it's because of the effects of the pushback that are happening internally. As you and I discussed before we went on the air, there's definitely factions pushing and pulling within the machinations of government, and we're seeing that happen in real time. And indeed, even if there's senators, Congress people that are willing to champion the cause, that are fairly unknown people, newcomers, that kind of thing, that's great. But we know that they often get drowned out by these more legacy forces within government that know how the machine really works. So that's why, for me, the Schumer legislation really stands out, not just because of the language, like you say, that is so specific, so precise, kind of remarkably so. I don't know how we would not see it that way. But that someone like Chuck Schumer is the one who's actually pushing the legislation, one of the most powerful people in government, period. So in some ways, it's an interesting mix of push and pull, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, that kind of thing, where I think a lot of people have a hard time making sense of it all. One thing we're going to try to do today, Liminal Frame style, is break it all down, talk about what is promising, what maybe not so much, and how all of this works together moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. And we've talked about as well how, in some respects, this is what you would expect to see as forward momentum is building and moving in a very clear kind of direction, at least I think from our perspective. As the topic itself gets discussed more broadly, you have opportunity for lots of different folks to kind of come out of the woodwork and throw a wrench into the plan, both maybe intentionally and even accidentally, because they think, oh, they've got some amazing footage they found in their dead uncle's basement or something, and it turns out to be, a total piece of bunk. So I think we should sort of prepare ourselves, right, to be seeing a lot more of that kind of content, and we've already seen some of that happen, particularly this week, but just in the recent weeks that we've been through. There's been some really fits and starts when it comes to sensational stories and content specifically. So I don't know, out of all those kinds of sensational stories, does one sort of jump out for you, or do you want to start with one in particular?
Well, I guess we can start with the Mexico fiasco. I know is kind of what I say. Yeah, that was remarkable. And that's a word that's kind of can be used a couple different ways, right? Not necessarily remarkable in a positive way. Remarkable is that something could make that much noise, could be inserted into the discussion in the midst of all these really serious positive moves. You hear conversations around air safety issues, national defense issues, these kinds of things, cutting edge technology that has major ramifications for geopolitical posturing. All those kinds of discussions are very serious. And in the midst of that, thinking that, again, I think most people thought we would see more and more of that. There was calls for international cooperation. People were hoping to see signs of that come forward in other countries, not just the U.S. And then that did happen in a way with these Mexico fiasco that happened. And I say fiasco, of course, because on the one hand, you had very credible people like Graves going down and giving testimony. And he thought, and kind of afterwards, he almost like apologized and regretted it, but he thought he was going to be doing more of the same as what he'd done in terms of testifying before Congress. Ryan Graves, I'm speaking up here. And yet what he found was in the midst of him giving testimony, there was also these apparent alien mummies presented as well, ended up being connected to people who have been known hoaxers in the past. Fairly elaborate hoaxes, but as you and I kind of joked about before we went on the air, we had a laugh together, because when you know that if this does get the attention you hope it does, all it's going to do in the end game is garner international attention, and you're actually going to have specialists examine these apparent mummies, these bodies, and it's going to become very apparent that they're not what you're saying they are, which raises the question, why even begin? It's almost like they maybe were working on a model of 5 years ago when they could say things, maybe, I don't know, sell some products or something, or make a movie out of it. But in this day and age, actually, we are seeing academics, scholars take these things seriously and actually look into them. We know that that's happened where we've actually had people like geneticists and people in those kind of fields look into these bodies like at atomic level and declare most of the time they're either like children that have been deformed in some way, or sometimes it's been a mixture of human bones and animal bones. Llamas, I think I heard, were in the mix. You're having weird like powders and things used and pastes to sort of make things look a certain way, which again might be impacting on the day when you have them placed in coffins in front of Mexican Congress. But again, that's not going to go very far in the long run. And what I heard some of the representatives there say about this open forum, as I guess what you could call it, I think people were thinking that there would be some vetting. They just have assumed there was vetting going in. Turns out there really wasn't vetting, and it was more like an open forum. If you have something to say about this, you can present your material. And I think one of even the Mexican representatives was quoted as saying something like, well, we just wanted to be able to hear all different perspectives. What you don't hear in that, but actually turns out to be the case, is that means there was zero vetting of anybody basically that came forward. So in the long game here, that's kind of unfortunate, because while you can on the one hand kind of laugh at it and again wonder about just how preposterous it is to present this, knowing it's never going to pay off in the long run in terms of actual crediting to him an actual find. But you just also have people that we know that have been experiencers, have been abducted in the past, have been part of the actual enterprise. And for them to see the whole thing kind of get, again, cast to the sidelines because it gets discredited by being associated with these kind of stunts is really unfortunate. And I think that's one thing I'd want to point people to, is that there is a real human cost to this, because while some people think this is fun and games and entertainment and how many people can I fool before they figure out this is a hoax, there are real people who suffered psychological harm around elements of their lives they're trying to make sense of and have been fighting their entire lives to be taken seriously. And to have this be thrown into the mix right in the midst of feeling like they were just on the cusp of having that moment finally happen is really, really unfortunate.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It is incredibly head-spinning, and even though I had a bit of fun at the top of the show poking at this particular episode that took place, I completely agree that this speaks to the complexity of the issue. We're getting shades of things that have happened in the past with this topic as well. I mean, recently you can think of, Stephen Greer and the Atacama skeleton and how that was very similarly presented and went through some rigorous testing that Gary Nolan, in fact, was involved with. But there have been other incidents just like that in the past in this topic, and each of those times, coincidentally or maybe not, typically occur when some real momentum is happening in the topic itself. And so I think what we're arguing for here is that this type of false starting is a little bit what we might expect to see because the topic is so muddied, convoluted, difficult to parse. The kind of veridical evidence that we'd want to have is very hard to come by, and the evidence that does exist is pretty much highly guarded by people that we don't have access to it. So it makes it very difficult for us to do the kind of work we'd want to do to really verify the claims of witnesses or what have you. It speaks to the difficult task ahead, quite frankly, of what, and we've spoken about this before on the show, what will it take to convince people that this is real? What kind of display or roadshow or reveal is the reveal that will be the one that convinces everyone that there is something to this and gets people to take it very seriously? And so it is a setback, unfortunately. I think that, just as you said, there was great effort by Ryan Graves. I think even Robert Salas was part of it. But then you had this as well as a little bit of a distraction or mudding the entire picture. We're going to see some more of that probably in the future, and we just need to prepare ourselves for that. And I think too, like thinking about it that way, as a community of people of interest, basically lobbying for this and trying to push for this to be taken seriously, we need to do a good job of observing, of being patient, of not jumping too quickly and onto the bandwagon when something is presented, even though that might satisfy our biases and really, get us all fired up to be like, oh, here we go. I think we all need to be a little bit careful and cautious before jumping in, just so that we give it that extra test of credibility that it deserves.
Indeed. And I think one thing that we want to do tonight, and we touched on this a little bit before we went on the air, is discuss the nuances of the different moves that have been happening, both the hoaxes as well as the positive moves, as well as things that seem like positive moves, but then are somewhat underwhelming when they actually happen, referring to the NASA briefing that happened this week as well. Because I think, again, many of us with a deep understanding of the nuances of this sometimes walk away with shock that our representatives seem to be either undereducated on these matters or deliberately obfuscating or something, because there's really strange events that happen. Or again, just when you think we're going to have this all-of-government kind of approach moving forward, we talked on recent episodes about how we really are seeing this uncanny and unprecedented bipartisan move towards disclosure, what apparently seems like that. And yet, when we have, for instance, organizations like NASA chiming in, you get the sense that either they're not even having basic conversations with other branches of the U.S. government, or they are deliberately playing dumb, like just sort of dumbing down what they do know and doing just enough to make it look like they are really moving on this. Being NASA, it should be within their purview to look into this, of course. They want to at least be seen as taking this seriously and recognizing it's within their purview. But then when you actually look into what they actually are doing, what they're saying, it always leaves something unfulfilled. And so, of course, many people, colleagues of ours, friends of ours within the community, shout giant conspiracy of conspiracies, a giant psyop almost, to make it look like this is being taken seriously like never before, and yet somehow the whole thing grinds to a halt. We, I think, being liminal frames, want to take a more nuanced approach. We want to not jump to conclusions, while at the same time we do recognize that there seems to be at times a coordinated approach towards making sure this doesn't go forward. And so we can get into that and be honest about that, while also trying to walk that line of not leaping to the conclusion of a vast conspiracy unless we have clear evidence that that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And we've talked about many times how there are multiple factions at work here, and that there are many levers, variables which can be controlled to dial up the temperature of disclosure and dial it back down. And you don't have one person at the control panel, right? You've got a lot of different forces at work here that are each with some different agendas, sometimes in alignment, sometimes not. And even those who might be in alignment might look at the progress that it might be making, and they might say to each other, well, this is going a little faster than we need it to right now. We might need to dial this back, and that might explain perhaps, some of the slowing down that we're seeing, in the various places. But you really don't even have to imagine that it is that bit of a large sort of orchestrated campaign, because, as we pointed out many times before, the momentum of consensus reality itself is very difficult to change, right? The it's like trying to steer a dinosaur. It's very hard to do. So it's going to take some time to really get this to move in a direction that we'd like it to. And also, as we talked about, I think in the last episode and other episodes for sure, there's a pace at which this can be digested, right? And we, as much as we really want all the secrets to be displayed on a table, or a curtain to be pulled back and everything to be revealed, you and I both know that it's not going to be that straightforward, and that it's not something that we really can all absorb in one moment like that. So I think we have to recalibrate our expectations for what may be coming, and not to get too distracted. We like saying this a lot. We said this with James and Dolly earlier this week by the light show. We have to be kind of keeping our eye on the ultimate goal here. So what are your thoughts on that, though? I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of and you did touch on it a little bit, but do you think that there is a coordinated effort to some degree to slow this down, or kind of put the toothpaste back in the tube? What is your instinct telling you here with things that have happened recently?
Well, I think one thing I would point out to people is that there are different factions within government who have different interests, actually, not necessarily just one or the other, not just pro-disclosure, anti-disclosure. Take, for instance, a congressperson who has funding coming from aerospace companies, for instance. They may not be thinking about the ultimate end game. They may just be thinking about, well, I need that funding for my next campaign, and I stay happy when they stay happy. So, in other words, their viewpoint is very narrow, and their interests are very self-centered in some ways. That's not necessarily part of some vast conspiracy, even though it is one more lever that is difficult to manage moving towards disclosure, because again, you not only have to have the end game, but you have to have all these little small interests, right, that are also part of the match going on as well. It's not just one chessboard and one chess game. It's many, many, as we've discussed on this show many times. Government, quote unquote, is a very complex array of different organizations, many different people sort of cut across all of society. So, and in the midst of that, when we have a culture that's very culturally divided, it's difficult to have something, like you said, this kind of enormity really take hold. When I reflect on some of the nuances here, let me just bring some of them to the table, because I think it's hard to answer that question in just one sentence. I sort of want to point to some of the different details that I would draw people's attention to. So on the one hand, we have people like Tom DeLonge, I think, has said in the past that NASA would be the ultimate agency that would be responsible for some kind of disclosure. And in a way, you would think that, yeah, that's how the story would go, because NASA is responsible for what's going on in outer space, how we are connected to the surrounding cosmos. So again, if you lean specifically on the extraterrestrial hypothesis, for instance, then that makes sense that NASA would be the one to finally sort of pull the trigger and make some sort of announcement. And so there are some people even saying that what you're seeing now is a bit of a farce, but it's still sincere in the sense that it's slowly ramping things up for the possibility of, again, this date around 2026, 2027, be the time when some sort of major reveal is going to happen, not necessarily because of government, but in spite of government, that the others may be planning some sort of major reveal at that point, and people within government know about that, the secret keepers and whatnot, and so they are planning this slow rollout to slowly desensitize people and acclimatize people to these notions so that when it finally is revealed, it's kind of already in people's notions of what's possible and what's likely even. And so I think what you're going to see, or at least you could argue what you will see, is little tidbits here and there. Well, we have something that looks like the signature of life. Like even that came out today, I don't know if you saw this, one planet that was discovered a long ways away, I think in the Leo system, that seems to show signs in its atmosphere of the blueprints of what could be life. And that's kind of how we look for life through the typical means, is we look at biosignatures, we look at chemical analysis around the atmosphere of planets and that kind of thing. We look for them to be in the Goldilocks zone where they could support conceivably life as we understand it. And just today, an announcement came out about a planet that's really, really promising. And literally there were astronomers saying this is a game changer. If this is what we think it is in terms of what it's indicating, this could be a perfect example, the best example yet, of a planet outside of our solar system that likely has life. So in the midst of all these conversations we're having about all these different elements, we also had this really sort of more customary analysis around this planet that might contain life using these old means of actually trying to measure that kind of thing, bypassing the entire conversation about are there others already here and how did they get here and those kind of things, which I also want to touch on. Bill Nelson, again, kind of said several things that were frustrating and confusing to me. One of the things he said was, well, let's just be honest, like this is a long way, light years, hundreds of light years. And again, he sort of doubled down on this notion that you'd have to travel through conventional means across space, nothing about like folding space or wormholes or interdimensionals or anything like that. Just a very sort of standard sense of you'd have to get in a spacecraft that's really fast and would take you a long time to get here. That seems unlikely. So when he says things like that, it's like pouring cold water on this. On the one hand, he'll say, there's something up there that we don't know what it is. But on the other hand, in his next breath, he'll really dial down the expectation on this actually being something like extraterrestrial, while at the same time, he keeps focusing on this terminology, extraterrestrial, rather than adopting the more appropriate terminology that the Schumer legislation did, which is non-human intelligence. Again, this raises questions about communication or the lack thereof. Why is NASA still using this terminology while the Schumer legislation is using a completely different one? It's almost like the Schumer legislation, internally, they've already had these conversations and they know that the extraterrestrial hypothesis, deferring here to Jacques Vallée's work, even back in the 1970s, is too simple an explanation for what we're seeing here. They recognize that they're already preparing people with that language for that revelation one day. And yet NASA is still using this term extraterrestrial, which, as we talked about before we went on the air, in some ways buys them some time because they can deny that there's any clear evidence of extraterrestrial life visiting us. But that is almost like a plausible deniability kind of situation there, where later on, if it is true that they actually have evidence of something here, but it doesn't fit the classically defined understanding of ET, then they are not caught in a lie. They're still technically telling the truth, but really buying themselves time while they try to figure out what their next moves are.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought up the NASA piece and Bill Nelson, the strange kind of double speak that is happening here, because it is a little bit head spinning when you look at both the NASA report and even how Nelson started the entire conference, and with the statistic that he gave, that our scientists have looked at probabilities. Like, I asked our scientists to look at the probability of life in the universe, and they came back and they said 1 trillion instances of life in the universe. I mean, 1 trillion, that's a very large number. So he's essentially telling you the probability of life in the universe other than ourselves is basically near 100. Very, very likely. But we're going to study this UAP stuff, and almost like in a way, like because we have to, and the government's asked us to do it, and we're pretty sure that it's all going to be prosaic anyway. We just need some better, instruments to measure this data. We need to get more, sort of observers, better way to collate the information, because it's all just this scrambled data that we can't make sense of. Once we get all that stuff, I'm pretty sure it's going to be just like ball lightning or a weather sprite or whatever. It's not going to be anything like really wild or crazy because it can't possibly be. It's essentially like what they're saying. A lot of those panelists are saying they don't want to give too much credence to the popular idea that there could be non-human intelligently controlled objects, in the world. They're leaving the door open, but they're really, just barely. It's sort of just like, here's a crack. And I think part of that is that there are a couple of things at work there. The real conspiracists could say, oh, here they go. Like they're just, they know better, and they're just kind of pulling the rug over our eyes. But the other part of me says, look, these are scientists, right? These are folks that have been part of the institution, part of the physicalist, materialist model. They look at the world a certain way. And when they do science, not only are they doing science to advance what we know, but they're also doing science to signal to other scientists to be taken seriously as a scientist, right? So you cannot get too crazy. You can't go, to Doc Brown and Back to the Future because you're going to lose credibility with all of your peers. And I think there's a lot of that at work here. And if this progresses in the way that I think it will, we're going to see that, yes, we'll get more data. Yes, we'll be able to better collate that data. And oh, wait, lo and behold, after doing all of that, yeah, we ruled out a lot of stuff, but man, there's still some weird incidents that we can't explain. And so then we start getting a little like the meter starts going a little bit closer to non-human intelligence, and they left the door open. So they're like, well, we didn't say it couldn't be that, but now we're not really sure what it is. So, maybe let's revisit that as an idea.
Right. And I want to get to in a second this question that everyone asks, which is, what does NASA say it knows versus what does NASA actually know about this matter, right? Before I go there, I want to quote a tweet I made right after the briefing. I said, quote, NASA Administrator Bill Nelson reducing the gravity of the Grush revelations to, paraphrasing here, one friend said this and another friend said that, is as disingenuous as it is disinformational. The facts, quote unquote, Nelson wants are bound up in classification, unquote. So clearly here, this was again one of the bait and switches that you felt like was happening in real time, because on the one hand, he really stressed almost like a little bit of that tinge of like scientific arrogance, like he was informing the ignorant public that what we really need is facts. This is not about what you think you saw. This is about what you actually saw. We want, objective sensor data and that kind of thing. And yet, when someone asked him specifically about the Grush revelations, he was so dismissive, and it was such a short answer. You want my personal opinion? Well, he said, one friend said this, another friend said that. I think everyone was just shocked by that, dismayed, because either, again, he's woefully misinformed and undereducated, or he's like deliberately obfuscating the seriousness of the allegations. So that's the first thing I would say about that. It was shocking to hear him say that. And then to have the gall to say, look, I just want facts. Show me the evidence. I think he literally said something like that, right? When it's very clear from Grush's own testimony, which was not in front of the National Enquirer, by the way, it was before Congress, that he did disclose additional information to the people who had the requisite clearances. And surely Bill Nelson knows that. He certainly should know it. And so it's not as simple as hearsay. It's about publicly, of course, Grush can only say so much. But in skiffs that we keep hearing about more than we ever have any other year, he can talk about this more. He has gone to different people with the appropriate clearances and has briefed them on this. And again, it was found to be urgent and credible what he said. So how do you match that from one branch of government, very high up, with what Bill Nelson said that was so dismissive? Again, it sounds, if nothing else, like a banana republic, that there's like, it's so preposterous how it's being run, like there's so little communication. Either that, which is preposterous in itself, or again, there's almost like this deliberate obfuscation. The other piece I wanted to touch on was I actually read the NASA document itself, the report. And again, just the way some things are worded, it sort of doesn't come out and say something, but it kind of implies something. So there's this one part where it says, quote, footage taken by an MQ-9 of an apparent silver orb-like object in the Middle East. And then it showed the picture. Then it says, due to limited data, the object remains unidentified, unquote. So the implication there is if they had better data, they would be able to identify it. And it would probably be something prosaic, like you talked about earlier. Either some sort of weather phenomenon or some sort of known state's arsenal, right? That's kind of what's implied there. And you even had that one reporter call in from the UK, I think it was ITV News or something, and you could hear the contempt dripping from his voice when he said, can you seriously not use this money for something worthwhile? Because we know this is a nothing burger. That's basically what the implication was. So even with all the movement there has been with congressional committees and that kind of thing, we still are seeing in the broader culture these disconnects where people are still talking about this like X-Files kind of jokes and whatnot. I think someone even actually mentioned that at some point. So this is kind of where we are. It's a really strange time.
Yeah, and it's like a high wire act, really, when you're watching some of the panelists kind of respond to those questions, because when that person did bring up the X-Files component, they didn't dismiss it either. They weren't saying like, yeah, exactly, X-Files. I mean, I wish we didn't have to deal with that crazy stuff. They didn't throw that out right. I think even Nelson responded to that comment in a way that was a little bit middle of the road. And so, they're doing their best, I think, in a way to keep the car on the highway. Basically, they're trying to drive this down and stay in the lane and not go too off road. And sometimes that's more successful than others. It's obvious though that the public, and this was just shown in the quality of the questions that were asked at that briefing, the public has tremendous interest in this. Not only the public, but our lawmakers have interest in this. Our governments have interest in this. And so it's not a matter of just waving it away now and being like, well, it's all going to be prosaic and it's just swamp gas. We're kind of done here. That there's basically a demand that we do some serious work here. And if you're an optimist and you looked at the NASA panel, you're going to come away going, okay, it sounds like they really are going to try to do some serious work. Now, you and I both talked about how frustrating it is that their approach is essentially, we don't have any good data right now. We're just going to have to collect great data going forward. I mean, come on, guys. We've had decades of data that we can go back and look at. And surely in the decades of data that we have somewhere that you NASA people could have access to, we have something of quality that we can look to and go, okay, we have enough here to make an analysis. But to pretend as if, well, we just got to turn the calibration knobs up a little bit over on our satellites so that we can get good data going forward. I mean, it's a little bit, I can understand the frustration by folks that know there is so much more that is available to these individuals for study. The other thing I'll talk about there is funding, right? We've got to give these agencies the money to be able to do these kinds of studies. And I think NASA historically has had a really hard time getting funds from the government. So that's going to be a real challenge. The other real challenge is the gentleman who was not named during the panel, even though they were being totally transparent with the public, but they didn't want to tell you his name, but who was later named, a gentleman by the name of Mark McInerney. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. McInerney, thank you. That's much better. So Mark McInerney was the previous NASA liaison to none other than the Department of Defense. So that's an interesting relationship there, and in a way sort of makes sense because they are running a lot of their work through Aero or in partnership with Aero. But the bottleneck here again seems to be the DoD. So a little bit of cause for concern there, or at least if you want to be a cynic about it, cause for concern. The optimist might say, well, that's a good thing. We've got kind of all this data that's being centralized, and there's going to be a way for us to manage the kind of rollout that we would want to manage should this come to pass. As Bill Nelson said, if something happens, you can bet your boots on it. I'll tell you about it. I love that phrase.
Yeah, a couple of things to point out there. Again, if nothing else, NASA is posturing itself to look like it's doing the right thing, right? Because like you said, there is this kind of double speak with Nelson, because on the one hand, when that ITV reporter was basically dripping with contempt that they would even bother to waste any time or money on a matter such as non-human intelligence or extraterrestrial life being here, that's when Nelson actually pushed back and said, nah, if you think we should bury our heads in the sand, that's not going to happen, not under my watch kind of thing. And that is what you want to hear. Like, that's what a scientific approach is that you don't assume something is or isn't the case ahead of time. You look at the data, you do the research, you do the analysis, and then you come to the conclusion. But on the other hand, again, in the next breath, he made light of the Grush revelations and made it sound like it was just hearsay from one guy. This is kind of the strangeness of this. The other piece I want to bring in too is that it's been in the rumor mill for a long, long time that NASA knows a lot more than they're letting on. So there's that question too. You would get the sense from Nelson and his colleagues in that briefing that this is a brand new push, that there seems to be some interesting new data we've never seen before around matters we've never even thought possible. And so we're now going to look at it because that's what we do. We always are honest and transparent about what's going on in the world and the cosmos. That's kind of the line they're taking. And yet there is so much evidence, for instance, has come up with looking into, for instance, photos that seem to have been airbrushed. We've had people who worked for NASA come out and give testimony that their job was to airbrush what were apparently UAP or UFOs, something anomalous in the photos. We have apparent history of the astronauts being kind of muzzled from speaking about what they actually saw up there. And some of them towards the end of their life kind of coming out and basically saying they ran into stuff that they weren't expecting. We have strange things like, why has it been so long since we've gone back to the moon? What is up with the moon? These are the things that are in play. And then on top of that, I would add, as my friend Sean Esbern-Hargens brought up today, I think on an IONS kind of event, there's the history of people like Chris Bledsoe being investigated and pursued by people associated with NASA, and them saying things like, we know they're up there, but we don't understand what they're here for. That's why we want to approach experiencers, because we know experiencers have information we do not. You're actually in communication with them. So my understanding is there were people high up in NASA that have a long history, even going back to even before it was NASA, actually, when it was still part of the Air Force. And they would do their darndest to actually first discredit experiencers they looked into, because they were actually looking for data. They were actually looking for objective data. Only in the rare cases where they found someone they really couldn't dismiss, they really felt like there was something happening. And then they would set up shop and study this person, interview this person, try to understand by talking to their friends, colleagues, neighbors, what was really going on. So when you add all of that up and you match that to what Bill Nelson and his colleagues are saying in that briefing, clearly those are two different histories. And so part of the mix here is trying to make sense of what is, again, as we say often in the show, the true 20th century versus the farce that sometimes is presented.
Yeah, it's a rocky road ahead. I think that's a way to look at all of this, that for those of you who are thinking that we were basically on cruise control and we're within 100 miles of the destination here, I think that has been made very clear this week that we're not in that position quite yet. Now, I did see that Chris Mellon posted today. He seemed fairly optimistic, and the progress, and I think rightly so, pointing out how much progress we've actually made since he started getting engaged on this topic. And he pointed out that the end zone basically is this Schumer legislation. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me just quote it, and then we can go into it, because I did write down the quote. Chris Mellon said today, quote, "When I set out on this journey, the goal was to get our government to take the UAP issue seriously and investigate appropriately. Now, in just 5 years, we have Congress, DOD, and NASA fully engaged. This is a huge achievement, all we could reasonably ask for. When the Schumer bill passes, we'll be in the end zone," unquote.
Yeah, okay, that's great, right? That sounds really positive. If Chris Mellon is positive, which seems to be fairly rare, then that's I take that as a good sign for the most part. Now, keep in mind, as I mentioned earlier, we haven't quite signed the Schumer legislation into law yet, so we've got to get over that hurdle. It's going to go through probably some committee. There could be some changes to it. But the fact that it mentions non-human intelligence upwards of 20 times, I mean, that's a huge, huge deal. And the fact that we have official positions now at various agencies who have been told that they have to treat this as a priority, as important, seriously. Again, we've come an incredibly long way, and it boggles the mind if you were to come away and go, well, this is all just, we're just all kind of doing this for fun because Chris Mellon asked us to do it. We're doing this to eventually rule it out as prosaic, and we'll finally put this UAP stuff to bed as we'll now understand some new atmospheric phenomena. It can't possibly be the case that is what is happening here, let alone the fact that we've got other governments in the world that have also echoed the same kinds of things. They're saying it's not their technology. They're saying that they're seeing these objects as well. So we are still on the right trajectory. I just think it's going to be a little bit longer than many of us would like. And that gets to one of my kind of pet peeves, or, I've spoken about this quite a lot this week. And that is that we really need to, I think, do some inward searching a little bit about what is wrapped up for us in this process. Why is it that we need XYZ in order to feel satisfied? And, really sit with that, sit with what that need is and why you're grasping at that next big reveal. And maybe as you kind of wrestle with that idea, you'll come to some, sense of conclusion that it's not all about that big reveal, that it's something bigger than that. And you need to be in a place where you're going to be at peace, regardless of, what presentation is displayed at the NASA headquarters.
Absolutely. And I think to start with what you began there with, yes, I think Chris Mellon was helpful in terms of sharing some context here, some perspective. It's easy to get too tunnel vision here and focus on the last 3 months and feel like this is a huge slowdown in what looked like progress. But when you widen the scope, open the aperture, as I like to say, go back to 2017 or even prior to that, where we were in 2015 to where we are now and likely will be in a time like 2025 is remarkably different. Already we had these groundbreaking pieces in the New York Times in 2017, as we've talked about many times, but that is pale in comparison to what we have now. And he kind of spoke to it. You've got Congress, DOD, and NASA fully engaged, at least apparently, right? Again, I want to stress that. And when he says, very interestingly, the final comment, when the Schumer bill passes, we'll be in the end zone. That to me almost sounds like some sense of he has an idea of what pieces will fall next once that happens. And again, as I said at the very beginning of the show, that to me is the ace up our sleeve. It's hard to imagine how the Schumer's legislation just goes away. Like, first it needs to pass, but again, like you said, it probably will. Schumer is not exactly a rookie. And that being the case, how does that kind of gravity of legislation not cause some major movement? There's this engagement with aerospace companies. There's these demands about timelines. There's discussion not only of non-human intelligence, but even not only pointing towards a historic cover-up, but actually talking about in detail how it was conducted, how this was actually hidden under the Department of Energy and nuclear secrets because it happened during the Cold War, inappropriately, by the way, in such a way as to keep Congress out of the loop and therefore not being under appropriate congressional oversight. All of these things are in play in that legislation. Again, it's even after a couple months now, when you go back and you read it again, you just shake your head. It's like, is this real life? Like, this is actually what's happening. So yes, I think it is helpful to step back and go, it does feel like over the last couple months, there has been a slowdown. We haven't seen this ignite like we thought it would, like a wildfire. And yet we are seeing progress. We are seeing steady, sure but steady progress. And that may be what's intended altogether. It may even be, I would suggest to some people, that the very people on the inside that want this to move forward are sometimes even putting on the brakes as well because they want it to go at a certain pace, either because they're trying to get it to line up with a certain event that's going to happen at a certain point in the future, like we've talked about, or they recognize that this is not in the public's best interest, and certainly not in their interest anyway, to have this drop too quickly, too suddenly, and be too broad-reaching. So they're trying to slowly acclimatize people to it, even if that means, again, adjusting the acceleration here and there so they get to the sort of optimum endpoint that they have in mind. That's one way I would think about looking at this entire situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've got some other content that's coming this year that many of us have been waiting for. There's the Netflix sort of special coming out from Steven Spielberg. There's the movie that Tom DeLonge had made and seemingly wasn't going to see the light of day, and now it's actually going to hit streaming very soon. Monsters of California, the trailer for that looked really interesting and has a lot of the ideas that, of course, we've been bouncing around over the last few years in the community. So once you start looking at those elements being seeded into the collective consciousness, that momentum can continue to build and move forward. But one thing we've talked about that I think is important to touch on, and ties into where we started to on this particular episode, and that is that the growth of information just broadly with the adoption and the explosion of generative AI tools, creating images and videos and audio and text. Basically, you can write a book for you if you wanted to. There's so much information. We're saturated with information right now from all kinds of different sides. It's going to be very difficult, almost nigh impossible in some respects, to discern fact from fiction in the world that we're moving into. And we are good at managing, I think, progress that is fairly predictable in its pace. But what we probably aren't good at is expecting exponential change, exponential growth. And that's something that is a very real possibility with AI. It's not just like, remember the days when you and I were growing up and it was sort of like the next Intel processor, it was just a little bit faster, or the next modem was a little bit faster. Got a modem. Really dating myself here. But we thought, every year we'll just get a little bit more processing power and I'll get a little bit better graphics, whatever. Yes, that was amazing. But we really can reach an inflection point where the jumping, distance is so much greater than what we've expected that it will catch us off guard. We're not equipped to handle that kind of change. And I do worry a little bit about what that will mean for us, particularly as it relates to this aspect of reality, coming to the fore. And maybe they are, quite frankly, intertwined to some degree. So I would like to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating thought you had at the end there. And I think that's something to get into as we unwrap this some more. We still have some additional elements we want to bring into the mix before we do that. Yes, partly what we're seeing right now is, in a way, what I think you should expect. And that is that when there is a legitimate push towards disclosure to talk about these very serious and real matters, you're going to simultaneously have this uprising of hoaxers and disinformation agents, which are separate parties, by the way, who want to not necessarily intend to muddy the waters, but just do because this is what human consciousness does where we are right now. And so, yes, you'll have things like the Mexico event, which was fairly quickly established as likely a hoax and part of an historical enterprise that was before declared to be a hoax. And you very quickly had universities, for instance, that were involved in carbon dating and things like that were mentioned, which kind of gives the allure of kind of credibility, academic credibility, very quickly come and say, wait a second, all we did was some carbon dating of material. We weren't told what it was. We're not supporting these conclusions whatsoever. And so very quickly kind of unraveled, somewhat like a mummy that you find in a tomb somewhere. But there are other ones, like I think you could maybe set up in a minute, this missing jet and some CGI generated information that came up around that and how difficult that was to separate fact from fiction. And this speaks to what you're talking about. When you have CGI of the quality where it is indistinguishable to the human eye. And this is why I think it's very, very funny that we still have on social media people going, that looks fake to me, or that looks legit. I don't even bother trying because I know a long time ago, CGI surpassed my ability with a naked eye to be able to parse. And even if you remember with TTSA, they talked about having technology that was able to analyze at a kind of granular digital level, whether or not something was a hoax or not, and could pull out information that the human eye just has no hope of doing. That was, 5 years ago or something. So now we're in a place where how much further we are in both the analysis to be able to establish when something is CGI, but in terms of just the sheer enormity of the number of images and videos, like you say, that are actually just generated by AI that's now floating in our reality, but also how there are some people who have almost a passion about constructing a false narrative fully with the hope that they will fool enough people. And they almost have this like game with each other, these hoaxers, where how far can I push the envelope where it takes that much longer before it's finally established as a hoax? You have that going on. In the midst of all that, again, getting back to what I touched on earlier, when we're trying to establish a very unpopular, or it's popularly in the public, but it's not popular with academia and with our political circles, you're trying to finally establish it as a legitimate field of study. In the midst of having all of this misinformation, disinformation, hoaxing going on, it just muddies the waters. Even people that should know better, the Neil deGrasse Tysons of the world, get sloppy and they just lump things together. Even people, again, that have academic backgrounds that should know better. So again, this speaks to the challenge we're in, as you sort of hinted at earlier, not just in terms of the technology, but also where our consciousness is on a collective level as we operate this increasingly sophisticated technology.
Our ability to edit reality as it is really increasing. We have to remember that things like video that, you and I grew up in a day, again, I'm dating us, but, when we grew up in a day where there was literal magnetic tape that images would be transferred to, that's not happening any longer. It's just all ones and zeros going into a machine. And when you have these elaborate CGI, efforts to create something that looks really convincing, well, sure, they eventually get, pieced apart. Incredible folks with, expertise in those fields are able to look at the code, look at the, aspects of it and go, aha, there's the digital signature that it's a fake. Well, that's great. But keep in mind that when that's done, we're not done. That ability to analyze the fault in that content only makes the next iteration even better. So we will rapidly approach a time where it basically becomes impossible to distinguish generated content from authentic content. There may be difficult for all of us. Maybe we'll come to a time in our human history where we won't even care, what is authentic or not.
That's a very interesting idea. And it may be the case that we have almost this notion where a false reality, as long as it's entertaining, almost think of lions in the Colosseum here, then some people will just adopt that. But what I was thinking there about was that how AI will change this as well. Not just generated AI images, but when you could actually ask an AI to construct an elaborate hoax that would fool many, many people. This is one thing that came up in the NASA conference. And I was actually glad this came up because people do have this weird understanding of AI sometimes. So I have a background in software engineering. I'm going to be involved in some of the AI we will use in trying to parse out data from the John Mack archives that have been now digitized and put into the Rice archives of the impossible. Somebody mentioned in that talk at that briefing that AI will be able to use kind of a multidimensional kind of analysis of data. And one of the guys had to chime in and say, just so we're clear here, we're not talking interdimensional, we're not talking extra dimensional, we're talking about additional parameters that it can consider when it's trying to parse data. And it can consider many more parameters at the same time, simultaneously, than can the human mind. But that's when it's used for good purposes, actually to ascertain the truth. But if you employ AI to fool human beings, it can do so with thousands of parameters, tens of thousands of parameters. It can consider possibilities in terms of you got to make sure this metadata matches up with this metadata that would never occur to a human being. Because the problem is right now we've been able to eventually establish these hoaxes because if you have enough human eyes, eventually human error, something somebody forgot, right? Yes, they use satellite image. Yes, they use drone imagery, but this date doesn't match this, or this metadata doesn't match this piece over here. It's really complex to figure out, but people can eventually do it with enough legwork. But when you have AI generating that, when it can conceive of thousands of parameters, then it's going to become increasingly difficult, especially when maybe a good portion of humanity doesn't even necessarily feel that much allegiance to the truth. then we really get into very, very strange territory.
Yes, indeed we do. It's a little bit head spinning, I think, in some respects. How do we, and this gets to the larger question, I think, in a way, like how do we transition into a time in our history where we have to compete and deal with the way that reality will be presented to us? I mean, look, if we're all being honest here, we've already been through, decades, centuries of reality management by state power, right? If you live in a civilization, you know what I'm talking about here. The history books are written by the states, the powers that be. And yes, if you live in more democratic states, you might get a little bit of a mixture of different historical perspective that you can evaluate. But the meta narrative is crafted, is designed, it is controlled, it is it is orchestrated by those who are in power. So give those who are in power even greater capacity to do so. I think it becomes incredibly daunting as just an average person to really figure out, make heads or tails of the truth. And so is it any coincidence, this is where I really want to go with this, is there any coincidence that we're approaching the dawn of this time, and disclosure itself seems right on the cusp of our discovery?
It's a great question, and I think it is the question we should be asking. Just the combination of factors that are coming together at the same time, a convergence, if you will, a confluence of these different factors, really makes you wonder. And again, we've had people in the past talk about the coming singularity. Now, on the one hand, I think that some of the languaging or some of the assumptions around that kind of discussion around a singularity, I would disagree with. Things around this assumption that, for instance, through computer power, we would eventually be able to create consciousness or upload our consciousness. There is that sense that would happen very quickly. There's still some people, again, operating under the physicalist paradigm that assume we will be able to do that. And pointing to the degree of exponential increase in technological capacity that you pointed to, some people assume that could be as early as 10 or 20 years out that we'll be able to do that. Again, that makes certain assumptions about the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, that kind of thing. It's only if consciousness is a byproduct of physical stuff that you could hope to do that. If it turns out that consciousness is primary and prior to what we perceive as a physical world, then of course it's a completely different equation. But nevertheless, even if you take that out of the singularity question, just what we're pointing to here, this exponential growth in technological capacity, the ability very, very soon to create realities, virtual realities that are so seamless and so convincing that not only will it fool people, but some people will be willfully fooled. We've also got this ongoing question around how will AI and robotics be introduced to the human genome? We look at some of these beings from the future, sometimes talking about whether or not they might be biobots. And I say future because, again, it's very clear to me that some of what we're dealing with is a future iteration of humanity or the workings of humanity, even the future workings of a very advanced generative AI, that now we're getting to the cusp of being able to intertwine technology with the human genetics. And what will that produce? Will that create a situation where you have sort of half the population or some part of the population says, I'm going to stay organic and natural, while other people move towards the cyborg route, right? These are the questions that are on the table. I could go on, and I think this is an interesting conversation for us to get into, because the question is it because this confluence of factors is coming together now that, as you point to, is perhaps why this apparent disclosure is happening now, or even the ramping up of these others' intervention in our civilization, because we are reaching a point of no return of sorts, and perhaps even a point of no return of which they are the product of. And so they are coming back to try to change that trajectory. These are some very, very interesting questions that arise once you really put the UFO phenomenon within this larger context.
Yeah, no doubt. That feels like a whole episode in and of itself, wrestling with those questions. And you can tell that, we've talked about this a little bit, but our lawmakers are not well equipped to even deal with this, right? And there was a lot of conversation about this week. In fact, there were some tech CEOs that went to Congress, and it was fairly clear from articles that I read that they're not even asking the right questions about how to put guardrails on artificial intelligence because they don't know what it is that we're talking about. They know that, I mean, few people do, quite frankly. And that's something that even the technologists will say, is that we built this and it can do this stuff. We're not even sure how it does it. So, asking lawmakers to come up with some, sort of gated way for us to control a technology that we don't even barely understand, it seems like an impossible task, right? So you could very easily see that we're playing with Pandora's box. We're basically about to open it. Well, for all we know, it's already been opened, and that the genie has already left the box, right? So and now, as you said, we could be witnessing an attempt to put this sort of back together again after many downstream events later, realizing that it didn't turn out so great, and so that could very well be what is at play. At least I think you and I would argue that is a part of what is at play. It just raises the complexity to a whole new level that I don't think we're quite there yet in the public conversation, particularly when we just keep hearing the refrain that we know it's not extraterrestrial. I mean, we're still so fixated on this extraterrestrial hypothesis as a society that you're just not seeing quite yet the traction of these other hypotheses that you'd want to see in the conversation for true disclosure, I think, to take place, for the table to really be set for that.
Yeah, again, it just points to what interesting times we live in. Again, speaking to what we discussed before with the exponential growth of technology, the problem is you don't have an equivalent increase in the procedural speed of Congress. If anything, you have a political set that are boomers, and you could argue perhaps aren't really up to the task of their job anymore. Some of them that refuse to retire even into their 80s and whatnot. We're likely going to have, or could quite likely have, a presidential election involving two quite senior people. In the midst of that, you have this incredible technological change that, as you point to, most people that are technologists and much younger generations don't understand. How do we expect these people who, were born in the era of World War II technology to understand it, and to hope that Congress or different governmental bodies could move with any kind of pace to actually deal with this at the pace at which it rolls out? It seems almost ridiculous to even think that that could happen. Again, I think what's interesting is you think about this time model, and you think about something like this metaphor I've used before of when you have a really impacting event. Think about like when a large rock drops into a pond. A small pebble will make a few concentric circles that will go a certain distance. A big rock will actually create these really large concentric circle waves that generate and push out in all directions. And so when you think about it pushing out in all directions, thinking about that in terms of time as well, that this sense we have, this kind of sense that involves things like the thinning of the veil that many experiencers speak to, the confluence of these different factors that are rising technologically, sociologically, seeing what's going on with climate change, the apparent ongoing intervention that seems to be ramping up of these others. As many people point out, even if Congress is slow to move and government disclosure process kind of begins to be like a stick in the mud, they don't seem to be slowing down their intervention and their sort of brazen displays in front of our military and things like that. So again, we want to keep in mind here, as I keep pointing out, they're not sitting on the sideline eating popcorn, leaving it up to us. They're going to be active players in this. And so you might even see what's going on in government be this kind of dialectic process almost, where they're trying to see, what if we go at this speed? How do they respond? And that kind of thing. Again, one thing I'd point out to people is that, yes, we have notions of accords happening historically, but don't make the assumption that it was one accord across government. As I was saying to you before we went on the air, not only is government a very complex array of different organizations and different groups with different agendas, but so too are different factions of others that are speaking to those different groups. So this is the complexity of what's in play here. And so when you really think about all these matters, and this is really, I think, the scope we should be approaching this matter from, rather than just saying, I'm here to finally see that UFOs are declared as real and they're actually alien, if that's your only two questions you're interested in, then really, I don't know that you're really invested in the human question here, invested in the journey of consciousness and how that fits in with this much larger scope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm shocked, and maybe I shouldn't be all that shocked at the degree to which many in our community seem to be in this purely for the entertainment value. That they just want to see them aliens, man. So it worries me a little bit that is kind of the primary incentive for even some of our most vocal folks in the community. And I say that only because of the reactions that I witness when we have events that have taken place, like we've seen recently. Their emotional state just seems to sort of be all over the place, and that to me is a signal. And again, I'm making a snap judgment. I could be wrong, but is a little bit of a signal that they haven't quite grappled with these deeper elements of what this all means. Again, this is a very big challenge. I guess I want to ask you something about the path that we're on as it relates to Dave Grush, right? So, we recently saw that he did an interview with Jesse Marcel. That's not right. Jesse Michaels. Anyway, I always get the last name wrong. But it was really well done, kind of like a documentary style. Jesse Marcel, I guess, was the Roswell guy. That's why I'm getting those names confused. But it was really well done and, very personable. Here, I saw a very intelligent guy in Dave Grush in that interview. Very well spoken, very knowledgeable about a variety of subjects. He seems to have, found out some interesting things. Of course, he's still holding very strongly to his security classifications and not revealing things that he can't reveal. But it's clear that he's been changed by the things that he discovered. And you and I talked a little bit about this with James earlier this week, but that was really eye-opening for me, for him to sort of come out and say, that I used to be kind of a religious person that I wasn't anymore, and now this has made me re-examine aspects of myself that I thought weren't really who I was. It changing my outlook on the world. It's funny because a lot of folks that you and I know, and I think ourselves included, would echo the exact same thing. So that tells me that it's more than just, here's an alien from another, solar system.
Indeed. And by the way, it's Jesse Michaels.
Thank you.
That's his name. Yes, that was a very interesting interview, basically documentary almost, in terms of the length and the scope that it went to in terms of introducing the human being that is David Grush. We talked about it a little bit in our interview with James Iandoli on engaging the phenomenon, but I think it is worth diving into that a little bit too, because again, as we kind of jokingly said before we went on the air, there's a few things that happened this week. It's been a very interesting week. And what that interview did was, first of all, as we said on the interview with James, it helped to humanize David Grush. We saw kind of a somewhat controlled, inhibited aspect of him in front of the Congress committee. But here he was much more loose, relaxed, laughing, riding ATVs, talking about llamas, that kind of thing. And you saw him even sort of wax philosophic around different hypotheses in terms of origins and whatnot. Clearly at that point, I just want to point out to people, he's not speaking about actual intelligence he has, but implications that he considers in light of what he saw. And that was very interesting. And of course, Jesse Michaels loves to go into all these nuances, and he pulls in these different elements from all the previous interviews he's done with Hal Puthoff and Jacques Vallée and these various characters in order to point to different things. He brought up time travel. He mentioned how many people don't realize that Jacques Vallée has kind of a fascination with time travel as well and how it relates to the UFO phenomenon. He even brought up how in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he encouraged that the time piece be part of it, even though it ended up not being the case. So that was very interesting. And to what you're pointing to there, which is kind of what we're getting into in this sort of last half hour, is the larger scope of this, getting beyond just UFOs being spaceships and the occupants being aliens. That what does this point to in terms of the larger scope of human history, human origins, human destiny? These are all questions we need to keep in mind. How do the existing meaning-making models of the world, things like religious institutions and whatnot, play into this. There's this discussion I see playing out in terms of, and you always hear it with these kinds of things, will religion survive the revelations of the UFO phenomenon? Which is an interesting way of putting it, because there's a couple of questions I would ask prior to that. One is, are our religious institutions and our religious narratives actually downstream derivatives of the UFO phenomenon, or what we call the UFO phenomenon? This sort of begs the question. So that's very interesting. And like you said, David Grush actually spoke to sort of being raised in those kind of circles, then kind of pursuing science, getting a physics degree, moving away from that. And then in light of what he's seen, he's come back full circle. He said this in front of a group of people. And I think, as you did there, I point people to that and get them to really consider, what are the implications there? What has he seen that would make him move in that direction? I use this term of archons in the last POC episode. It almost speaks to that kind of level of civilization engineering, almost, is what we're talking about here. So that's what came up for me when I think about that interview.
Indeed. Will religion survive the phenomena? And you touched on this, but I would argue the phenomena has created it in a way. So every contact point that we seem to have had with whatever this is seemingly spurs something within us that looks like a religious devotion or behavior or belief. And, it's interesting that we just happen to live in a day and age where the religion word is used pejoratively. It's used as sort of a lowbrow way of looking at the world. Most of human history hasn't been that way. There hasn't been this, here's this way of thinking about reality, and here's religion. Like there's bifurcation hasn't really existed for the majority of human history. They have been very much intertwined, and perhaps they always should have been intertwined. I think we need to examine things like this, our bias toward our belief in scientism, and that it has kind of paramount value over other aspects of experience. We really do need to grapple with that and do that, the hard work of examining, is that correct? I was struck today by this thought that we have built so many things around us. We have, through the power of our science, we've created so many amazing things and amazing experiences and technologies that we've almost like put our humanity in the corner of the room. It's like there's very little space even in the room left for what it means to be a human being, because everything else in the space is constructed through science and technology, and as a result, our what it means to be human, the importance of who we are, becomes diminished in the process, so that we're basically reduced to subservient to these other kinds of forces in the world. And I think the phenomena, at least from what I have observed, is challenging that idea, is challenging that kind of progression or potential path of progression, and asking us to think about reality in totally different ways. And so that's where I believe we're headed, almost like reclaiming or course correcting the path that we have been on, because we are on a path that is basically like denying who we actually are.
Indeed, I actually saw someone post an interview with John Mack today, where John Mack actually made that point, that one of the most compelling data points that suggested to him that people really were being abducted, or what they perceived as some sort of physical abduction, by actual beings and having real encounters with another kind of intelligence, was how much it changed their worldview, how they behaved, how they were transformed as a result of these interactions with these beings. So basically, again, this is worth pointing to, and this was also borne out in the free research that came out as well, the Dr. Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation, which is now CCRI. They found that regardless of these different contact modalities, it could be a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, a contact with non-human intelligence, variety of ways that this could happen, but the end result was very similar, which was a vastly different understanding of the nature of reality, and even perhaps more importantly, the purpose of being here, the purpose of the entire enterprise. So when we talk about, again, something as narrow as, I just want to see them bodies and be able to touch one of them craft, that really is a very dumbed down version of the questions in play here. What we should be asking ourselves are questions related to what you just said. How off course are we that when people encounter these kinds of beings, they come back with a completely rewritten understanding of what reality is and what their purpose is? Of course, you can't separate this from life and death and reincarnation. And one of the really interesting aspects that I like to think about is that, and this has come up in some of the research I've done and some of the intelligence I've seen, we often think about the possibility that these beings may have engineered us or our civilization, or at least tweaked us along the way, augmented us, those kinds of things. I touched on that in my last POC episode. But what I would suggest to people is they also consider widening the scope again and asking, could even notions that are built into our understanding, at least in terms of religious understanding, around things like reincarnation, could that also be part of an engineered construct? These are questions often that we separate when people say religion's one question, the UFO phenomenon is another one. Well, even elements within religious history and even human experience might also be part of the construct. So if it is indeed the case that space-time itself is kind of the stage that is set for the evolution of consciousness, and is very much a derivative, less important aspect than the actual evolution of consciousness, then number one, we clearly are on the wrong trajectory because we, as you say, are focused on how science and technology can change our environment, but not really change who we are, not really speak to who we are, and moving towards more of a connected sense of things. Even when you think back to encounters like at the Ariel School in Zimbabwe, they made this very clear that we are on the wrong trajectory, that even when you hear these kids talk about something like, we're too science techie. I forget what
technology
word they used. Right. But it was a little kid trying to basically say this exact thing, that our incessant focus on technology for the sake of technology is leading us astray. And it's making us confused about, forgetting about the real reason we're here. And one of the most interesting aspects of actual encounters with so many of these beings is that it helps to remind people of why they're actually here. And even that some of these beings that some people consider extraterrestrials or interdimensionals do seem more like angels, these light beings. You know, I've recently been watching a few different near-death experiences. And so many times they describe these tall beings that were kind of glowing, that didn't really have faces, but they still looked basically humanoid. They sensed this profound sense of love, this sense of unconditional benevolence, and how much that could easily be a UFO encounter, but instead it's a near-death experience. Again, this is what the free research found as well. So this is what this really points to in the largest context.
Yeah, it makes you question the crash retrievals. It makes you question those pieces of technology, where they may have led us to these moments now, as kind of a fool's errand or a diversion or an alternate developmental path that is away from our originally intended purpose. You said if we were designed to sort of be optimally structured for the development of consciousness itself, but now we've been distracted by the shiny lights over here, and we've just developed our own shiny lights, and we're kind of we're moving away from our intended purpose, and that is, it's troubling in many ways, right? Sobering, somber, that we maybe have voluntarily followed kind of a Pied Piper in a way down this path that we shouldn't have followed. And maybe we're seeing right now a bit of a challenge to that, or an unraveling of that, to where we might have a chance to choose differently, to make a different decision and hopefully right the course, or if not, to our peril, perhaps. And that always seems to be the case, right? Playing with technology, this is true. Just going back to playing with fire, you play with it enough, you're going to get burned. So that does seem to be a pretty common theme there that we can all relate to. So I guess we touched on so many themes on this episode, and I wanted to kind of bring the plane, down a little bit and try to land this. But how do you, I know you get this question a lot, but how do you exercise discernment to be able to parse through all the noise here? I mean, what are some things you can give people in terms of advice on how to navigate that? Because there is just so much happening.
Well, I think one thing I'd point to is what we've been discussing the last few minutes, that I would challenge people or encourage people to think about what questions they're really invested in. One thing that's become really evident to me and convicting to me is that there is this architecture in place in terms of these others having some say in not just the evolution of our consciousness and of our civilization, but even the beginning of it. But one thing I'd want to point to people is that one aspect that comes up often with these others is that while they may be running the zoo, so to speak, they have the zebra exhibit over here, they have the human exhibit over here, it's still the case, though, that we are all fragments of source consciousness. One of the things I said in my most recent POC episode is something that literally came from one of these others. And basically, this is what was said. Consciousness is what generates interdimensional quantum coherence. So what's interesting there is it's implying basically that what we perceive as physical reality is glued together, is a product of this quantum coherence amongst different conscious agents that you might use as a term in terms of Donald Hoffman's kind of terminology. The point being I'm getting at here is that even with reincarnation, some people might say, and I've heard people make this argument, you've probably heard this, don't go towards the light. It's a trap. It's the beings trying to get you to lock into something. I really want to caution people to not let fear come in like that. Again, you can have a construct that serves a purpose of evolving consciousness and it still be within this overarching move towards unity consciousness. And that, again, these beings are part of that process as well. Even if they're given sort of jurisdiction over one district of the cosmos, and that might be the human equation here on planet Earth, it's still within this larger context. So one thing I point out to people is you still have the opportunity to be aware of your own karmic load, to be aware of your own energy. There's a couple of things I would say about energy here. Number one, rather than getting caught up in these interesting but somewhat titillating side conversations around, well, cool, aliens and UFOs, our primary question should be, why am I here? Am I attending to that purpose of why I'm here? What am I doing about it? Am I just rushing through life until the grave hits me and I'm just chasing one fascination after another and trying to pay the mortgage and raise my kids, which are all important things. But if in the midst of that, you don't ask, why am I here? And am I working on that? Then I would suggest you're missing the forest for the trees. So on the one hand, you want to make sure you're asking those questions. And my point I would make here is that even if you feel this daunting sense of there's these intelligences, these quote unquote alien intelligences wielding some control over us, I would just encourage people with the notion that because you're source consciousness, you can skip a grade. You can actually achieve enlightenment where you exit this construct altogether. That's just what's built into the overarching system. And so don't look at it like, oh, instead of God, there's just these alien beings that controlled us and we're part of their experiment. That's not the case. There's source consciousness and all these different conscious agents throughout the universe, rays, light beings, tall whites, Nordics, standard Homo sapiens sapiens are all fragments of that source consciousness. And because of that, have as our birthright the ability to pay attention to our energy, to resolve our energy, and by doing that, fundamentally changing our relationship with reality in the next iteration. We may come back because we have to repeat some lessons we didn't learn the first time, but that's not because we're trapped under some sort of alien overarching architecture, but more because that's just the way the consciousness game works. And if we really do pay attention and resolve our energy and move forward and sort of leave with this kind of silent cleanness about us, then we actually, just as a byproduct of the system, will vault beyond this construct altogether and actually can experience a kind of post-physical kind of existence that some of the great saints and sages of history, Ramana Maharshi, Jesus, Buddha, Lao Tzu, all these people that had this awareness of this kind of super conscious state, that's kind of what's on the table for us in the midst of this conversation about alien beings controlling a construct around us. So I would really encourage people to not be too focused on things that are at the end of the day kind of distractions or pyrotechnics or the light show, like you say, but also not to be caught up in the sense that we are controlled and have no freedom or agency within this construct.
Yes. choose to get off the hamster wheel, right? We can really be fixated by that and enjoy that activity of just basically chasing our tail on that wheel there, and we can just get off, and we cannot do that any longer. And I think that one of the things that saddens me the most is that there's an element within really any community that kind of gets fixated on some of these very sticky physical kinds of things, is that all of their attention is placed there. All of their awareness is placed there. They live, they breathe, everything about that. And in the rest of their life, there's nothing. There's no attention. There's no awareness. There's no presence. There's no radical transparency, as you like to say, because everything is wrapped up in this wanting of whatever it is, whether that's the new car, the new house, the UFO, it doesn't matter. All of their mind and attention is wrapped up in acquiring that thing when it really needs to be going elsewhere. And I know that's a huge, hugely important thing in what you're talking about and working on. It's important to me. And really, I think if you started on this journey with us because of UFOs, I hope that by this point you're coming to the realization that we're not going to be always focused on that. There is more to the story than just that piece of it.
Indeed, and I would just encourage people with this, that this is going to be the kind of conversation here on Liminal Frames where we try to take the broadest perspective, the 30,000-foot view. We open the aperture. We always will ask these questions within this context of what is our purpose, what is reality, these kinds of questions. And again, if you're interested in the UFO phenomenon and you find yourself experiencing rage or frustration around the lack of progress, or the lack of speed towards progress, again, I would just encourage you to be aware of your own energy. Be aware that while you can feel frustration, you are emitting energy into the cosmos when you do that. And you can still choose to be either part of the problem or part of the solution. We have, unfortunately, low conscious people leading us in many ways around the world. But a way that we actually move things forward is by being aware of our own energy. Again, not only will that impact what happens here and make the people around you happier because you're a happier person, more contented, but again, that is your chief responsibility, that the energy you emit not only changes your context, that's the way you can directly impact the reality of the world, even if it feels overwhelming and you feel like a person with no agency. But also it's the most important factor in terms of determining what happens next. And no other being is controlling that for you. That's completely within your own power.
I'm going to give you an amen on that. Thank you. Well, again, thank you all for joining us on the show. It's a pleasure to have these conversations with all of you in the community. You inspire us and motivate us and give us amazing ideas to discuss. And we look forward to where this conversation is going and growing. It is growing, Darren, that the group of folks that are engaging with the content and are asking these kinds of questions is really growing. And that's encouraging, I know, to both of us. And we look forward to where that journey will take us. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.